clear with me. Don't go a second over 12 and a half. So. But anyway, it's always difficult to know where to start in these short talks, but as many of you know, on January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro, Batista flees Cuba. A week later, Fidel Castro comes in, and everybody was expecting a democracy, a restoration of the Constitution of 1940, but almost from the get-go, without going into too much detail, it turned out to be something very different. Besides postponing elections, abolishing political parties, we all of a sudden start to see show trials, executions on television, and there's a lot of, and of course show trials without following any legal process. And a lot of people knew right away, this is something very different. This is not what we were expecting. Castro had appointed a cabinet filled with Democratic figures, and then by mid-year, they were all purged. They were being replaced by communists at different levels of government, and then kind of a panic broke out. What direction is this going in? And it was very clear, and I think you can sum it up without going into a lot of detail by saying what I often say is that communism entered Cuba inside a democratic Trojan horse, because it was a matter of weeks or months before these communists started to jump out of this horse, and well-known communist figures. By mid-year and by the fall, many of Castro's former allies, besides the political figures that had been purged or that had left the government, you also had members of the rebel armed forces who were now leaving, who were being arrested, who were being put in prison, who were fleeing into exile, who were founding opposition groups even before the end of 1959. And certainly there was fear that this was communism, that this was a manipulation. The feel was different. The streets are filled now with militant followers, youth organizations, and everything starts to be militarized around this ideal and this idea of the revolution, a certain fanaticism, which isn't what was supposed to happen. What was supposed to happen was a restoration of liberal democracy, right? And instead, you're getting this militant movement. 1960, everything happened very quickly. In 1960, in February, Anastas Mikoyan, the Soviet leader, first deputy premier, visits Cuba on a very famous visit. He meets with Fidel Castro. He helps open a scientific exhibit. And of course, this was confirmation of what everybody had suspected. Cuba is going communist. Within weeks, trade agreements with the Soviet Union, an alliance with the Soviet Union, and there was absolute alarm. That spring, all of Cuba's media, Cuba had one of the best media sectors in the Western Hemisphere. Television, radio, print, a tremendously free culture, very developed, all of it within months. Every newspaper, every radio station, every television station taken over by the government. The University of Havana's autonomy, right, abolished, and the government essentially taking over the university, firing 2/3 of its professors. We start to see later in that year the establishment of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, which were block by block vigilant groups meant to spy on neighbors who were acting in a counter-revolutionary manner, right? And this is the government doing this. We see the establishment of the militia, right? A citizens' militia marching up and down the street, defending the revolution, defending Castro, condemning those who were not as enthusiastic as they were, right? To say nothing about those who were against them or who were perceived to be against them. Suddenly, there's this physical force in the street. This isn't somebody on the radio. This isn't someone on TV, criticizing people who aren't with the government. This is an actual armed force in the street, in front of your house, outside of your church, or whatever it was. And things were getting very scary. And then you had youth organizations that were doing the same thing and pressuring young people to join these groups. Beyond this, you had in the fall of 1960, another sweeping takeover of private businesses, banks, rental property, etc. And things were being radicalized, and it wasn't just ideological, physical force on the streets of militia, of CDRs, etc. And for parents seeing those youth organizations in the street, they knew enough to know that communism is going to seek to take the children, remove the parents' authority, whether literally or virtually, right, to create the next generation of content. And that wasn't only offensive to the parents, I think, because who are you to take over raising my kid? But you're also going to form him in a way that we find offensive and that we are against. But there was the real threat that the schools were going to be taken over, that the government was going to take over the education system, and close all the private schools as well, that parental authority was going to be taken. There was a lot of pressure, especially on religious schools, and a lot of harassment of religious schools. We start to see an anti-clerical campaign, anti-religious campaign, anti-Catholic school campaign, and a lot of people knew that, and the Catholic schools have become almost the last bastion where kids could be protected, right, from what was happening in the street, and those are under threat. In 1961, it'll be declared the Year of Education. And the Year of Education meant that they were going to close down all the schools, right, temporarily. And during that time, the young people who knew how to read were going to be organized and taken out into the country to teach the peasants how to read and make them literate. And that sounds wonderful, because on the surface, how could you be against literacy? But the irony is that this is done about a year after the government took over the entire media. So the only thing people could read and see in Cuba was what the government put out. So it was almost to facilitate propaganda, and it was a show. Cuba had an almost 80% literacy rate at the time, one of the highest in the entire hemisphere. This wasn't so much about those who were illiterate, it was more about the teachers. We're going to organize young people, organize them into brigades. It was the first mass mobilization of communist Cuba. And the point is, we're going to separate the teachers, who were teenagers, from their parents, right? And we're going to use that time to indoctrinate them into revolutionary ideals while they are teaching and, in this supposed Peace Corps type environment, right? And that caused, and of course, meantime, we're organizing the new schools that are going to open later on. And of course, those new schools were going to form the new man and the new woman of the revolution, of the now communist revolution. So there was a lot of panic in Cuba, but already by 1959, 1960, it was there, and it's only going to get worse. And by the way, everything the parents predicted, everything they saw coming, it was prophetic. Not only did it actually happen, but it was actually worse than they had imagined. And I want to emphasize that because the Cuban government's argument, because they have to come up with responses to things, right? And here you have relatively normal, middle class, mostly parents, rational people, who were pushed into taking the drastic step of taking their children, and a lot of you know how overprotective Cuban parents are. These kids, probably most of them, wouldn't have been allowed to take the bus by themselves, right? Putting them on an airplane by themselves and trusting fate and the Catholic Church and the United States to raise them. I mean, imagine what that is, letting your kid go. How bad do things have to be? And of course, the Cuban government has to explain that years later, right? So they make it look like, all those parents were, you couldn't say that they were all counter-revolutionary and evil people, because they were normal people. So the only thing it could be, it was the United States' fault, right? The United States and the CIA, in a propaganda game, made up this whole thing and put all this fear into the minds of parents, right? And it was all false. And they did it to undermine the revolution, etc., which of course, all you have to do is look at what actually happened, right? Look what happened to people who fit the Pedro Pan profile, who stayed in Cuba, who couldn't get out, right? Because they shut the flight or whatever it was. We have Mumat camps, the forced labor camps, right? And every atrocity you can imagine committed against youth in a totalitarian society. I'm not even going to list them because I'm down to 3 minutes. Okay, actually occurred in communist Cuba. Now, very quickly on the United States side, I wish I had more time, but by 1960, there was already a refugee crisis in Miami with people leaving. Monsignor Brian Walsh, was the head of the Catholic Welfare Bureau. He's seeing the crisis in other social service agencies, convinced that there's going to be unaccompanied children sooner or later, which would have fallen under his purview. In November 1960, they bring a 15-year-old boy who'd been on the street, whose parents had sent him to prevent communist indoctrination, and he felt that more would come. He was able to put together a system with other social welfare agencies and the federal government that if unaccompanied children arrived, okay, there would be federal money, and that federal money would be used to fund private religious organizations to provide care, right? Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant, right? In the meantime, James Baker, the head of Ruston Academy in Havana, was working with the Cuban underground. He had come to Miami to establish a temporary boarding school for the children of underground operatives who felt that the government would go after their children if they couldn't catch them. He meets Father Walsh. Father Walsh convinces him to drop the idea of a boarding school, that he had the promise of federal funds, he had a system, he had a blueprint in case Cuban kids started showing up. They agreed to work together. Mr. Baker went back to Cuba with a plan with Walsh to bring over 200 kids with student visas. Remember, the United States and Cuba still had diplomatic relations, right? He went back. I'm not going to go through the whole history of that because we don't have time, but the point is a few kids were able to leave, but Cuba and the United States broke diplomatic relations 6 weeks later or so, in early January 1960. So everybody thought it was over, but Mr. Baker convened a committee in Havana to continue this effort by getting the children out via Jamaica with British visas and on KLM Airlines. They had connections to the British and the Dutch. He shows up in Miami with this idea. Walsh goes to Washington to see if they could do it. The State Department says, yes, you can, and by the way, how would you like visa waivers? Okay, so what, and I'm going to go over by 1 minute. Right, but what were the visa waivers? This was an incredible thing. A visa waiver was something that the United States issued in emergency cases, once every 15 blue moons in case of an emergency. But it represented a loophole because there were a lot of Cubans in Cuba who wanted to leave, and the United States was interested in helping them leave. So the United States said, why don't we issue visa waivers to Cuba? The United States issued over 400,000 visa waivers in just a couple of years, right, to all Cubans. But to get a visa waiver, you had to have a first-degree relative in the United States. Ask for one, they cost money, you have to send it to Cuba, right? And a lot of Cubans got out with the visa waivers. The difference between what Walsh was given is that Walsh was given the authority to produce visa waivers on Catholic Welfare Bureau letterhead. And he was authorized to sign visa waivers. Him, right, which is incredible. Walsh didn't work for the State Department, right? He was a priest. And yet he had the right to do it. And so most of the Pedro Pan kids are going to come over with these visa waivers. Walsh, of course, is going to get those federal funds eventually. With that, later it's going to be attached to the Cuban refugee program. And with that, he's going to build a small network of camps in Miami for the children, which turned out to be more transit centers, because this thing is going to grow and grow and grow. He's going to create a network all across the United States, was it 48 states, was it? And Puerto Rico, of foster homes, group homes, I mean, you name it. I don't know how many Catholic dioceses, I forget now, but this 30-year-old priest put together this unprecedented program, not only to bring these children out of Cuba and to help these parents, but also to provide for care for about half of them. And I do want to point this out, on another note, again, in response to some of the counter arguments. The number of families who were leaving Cuba to protect their kids during these years was off the charts in numbers. We all, those of us who grew up in the community know how many families, we could probably name 5 right off the top of our head, who left Cuba, mother, father, children, to protect their children from what was happening. So it wasn't just the Pedro Pan children. Entire families were leaving, right? The Pedro Pan children represented those families who were in a situation where for some reason they couldn't all leave, or the parents couldn't leave, or they had the chance to send the children and they didn't want to miss that chance, that they would figure it out, how they would get out later, or the kids, when you get there, send a visa waiver to me, whatever it was. But entire families were leaving, right, for that same reason. It wasn't like, these special families were picked by the CIA, to send their kids over, right? This was, and It continued, and it continued. Look at the freedom flights later. There was a second Pedro Pan, so to speak, to Spain in the mid-1960s, early 1970s. That was 6, 7, 8 years into the revolution, and parents were saying, and Jan Gonzalez, his mother put him on a raft to get him out of Cuba, how many years later? This continued, right? And the Cuban government's depiction of it, of course, is absolutely absurd. I'm like 14 minutes going.